This hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will come to order. Secretary Blinken, thank you for joining us today. Last week, the New York Times reported on a local Afghan reporter who goes by the name of Nemat. He was covering a demonstration by several women protesting against the Taliban. He was arrested. His camera was confiscated. Nemat said, and I quote, "I told them I was a journalist and showed them my ID card, but they accused me of organizing the protests. They took me into a room, tied my hands with a scarf, and started beating me with a cable." The horror he experienced is hard to fathom. He described a demonstrator covered in blood after being severely beaten and saw Taliban militants abusing prisoners. One of Nemat's colleagues said, "They were mocking us and saying, 'You want freedom? What freedom?' This is not the Taliban of 2001. This happened last week. Amid the extensive oversight work planned in Afghanistan, we must not lose sight of people like Nemat and the courageous women who continue to protest in the streets, calling for freedom in the face of violence and threats. The repression of the Afghan people is happening in real time, and the world must bear witness and hold the Taliban accountable. Let me turn to the focus of today's hearing. Mr. Secretary, the execution of the U.S. withdrawal was clearly and fatally flawed. This committee expects to receive a full explanation of the administration's decisions on Afghanistan since coming into office last January. There has to be accountability. We will have other hearings to develop a set of lessons learned over the course of the war to understand the many mistakes made over the course of 20 years. The diversion of attention and resources when the Bush administration decided to invade Iraq, despite its irrelevance to the 9/11 attacks. The double dealing by Pakistan in providing a safe haven to the Taliban, and the list goes on. We need to understand why successive administrations made so many of the same mistakes repeatedly. Perhaps most urgently, we need to understand why the Afghan government and military collapsed so precipitously. This rapid collapse laid bare a fundamental fact, that successive administrations lied to the Congress over the years about the durability of Afghan military and governing institutions, and we need to understand why. The chaos of last August is due in large part to the February 2020 surrender deal negotiated by President Trump, a deal that was clearly built on a set of lies. A deal that led to the release of 5,000 hardened Taliban fighters, boosting the militant group on the battlefield this summer. We know now that the Taliban had no intention of pursuing a political path and peace deal with the Afghan government. It had no intention of pursuing a democratic path. It had no intention of breaking ties with al-Qaeda. And it clearly had no intention of allowing women to have their rightful seat at the table and to participate fully in society. To demand the Taliban abide by its commitments now and expect a different result, I think, is somewhat absurd. The Taliban rules Afghanistan, so we will have to deal with it in some form. But let's not kid ourselves. There is no such thing as a reformed Taliban. This group is woefully stuck in the 14th century with no will to come out. Their concept of political representation and legitimacy is based squarely on the use of violent force and intimidation. The administration says that we should judge the Taliban by their actions, and I agree. And their actions since taking over Afghanistan have been pretty horrifying. Beating women activists, murdering ethnic and religious minorities such as the Hazara, separating classrooms by gender, shutting down local media, refusal to break with al-Qaeda, appointing the head of a foreign terrorist organization as designated by our government from the Al-Qaeda network to lead the Ministry of Interior, and the list goes on. With this in mind, the United States and the United Nations should maintain existing sanctions on the Taliban. The U.S. should reimpose those sanctions that were waived during the negotiations process. And the U.S. should consider new measures to impose higher costs on the group and its leaders while ensuring that life-saving humanitarian aid is able to assist those most vulnerable to hunger, disease, and disaster. Nor should any country be in a rush to unilaterally recognize this regime. At a minimum, the following criteria must be met before recognition is even considered. Absolute repudiation of the Taliban of all cross-border terrorism, including al-Qaeda and associated groups. Equality of rights for girls and women. Protection of minority ethnic and religious groups. Commitment to democratic elections and ending all narcotics-related activity. So yes, the Taliban now run Afghanistan, but that does not mean we ever accept their behavior. I supported the decision to eventually withdraw our military from Afghanistan. I have long maintained, however, that how the United States left mattered. Doing the right thing in the wrong way can end up being the wrong thing. And to get this right, the Biden administration needed to answer two fundamental questions. First, would the withdrawal leave a durable political arrangement in its wake? Second, would the U.S. and our allies maintain an ability to collect intelligence to conduct counter-terrorism operations in a region still rife with groups, including ISIS-K, seeking to do us harm? I believe the U.S. clearly fell short on the first measure, and time will tell on the second, but the prospects don't look promising. So let me start with some framing questions about the Biden administration's Afghanistan decision-making. First, upon coming into office, how did the Biden administration assess the impact on the ground of President Trump's flawed deal with the Taliban? Did the administration attempt to negotiate better terms with the Taliban upon coming into office? Second, did the president's April withdrawal announcement set in motion any explicit contingency planning in the event that the Taliban rapidly took over the country? What was the plan to evacuate all Americans? What was the plan to evacuate SIVs, P1s, P2s, and other at-risk groups? What was the plan to evacuate staff and those affiliated with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, the National Endowment for Democracy, and other U.S.-funded organizations? President Trump, with Stephen Miller, intentionally blocked SIVs from being processed, which I think is a barbaric and cruel decision which likely resulted in death for some U.S. partners. How did the Biden administration specifically accelerate processing SIVs upon coming into office? And third, what was the plan to avoid or deal with a refugee and humanitarian crisis? I expect you'll address some of these issues in your opening remarks. Let me applaud the efforts of the personnel on the ground from the Departments of State and Defense who worked under horrific circumstances. Their actions in evacuating over 120,000 individuals were nothing short of heroic, and these personnel deserve answers. The American public deserves answers, and the Afghan people certainly deserve answers. So let me close with 3 points. First, while communication from the administration has been frequent throughout this crisis, information from State, the Pentagon, and the White House has often been vague or contradictory. This was obviously a fluid and difficult situation. Frustration among many members was high, and this has to improve. And to put this in context, member frustration came on top of years of stonewalling by the Trump administration and its refusal to engage the Senate on the Taliban negotiations. This is one of the examples why I have been trying to pursue on the CASE Act to understand what are the written agreements that come between an administration and others. Maybe if we had seen all of the elements of it, we would have been poised in a better position. Second, I'm very disappointed that Secretary Austin declined our request to testify today. A full accounting of the U.S. response to this crisis is not complete without the Pentagon, especially when it comes to understanding the complete collapse of the U.S.-trained and funded Afghan military. His decision not to appear before the committee will affect my personal judgment on Department of Defense nominees. I expect the Secretary will avail himself to the committee in the near future, and if he does not, I may consider the use of committee subpoena power to compel him and others over the course of these last 20 years to testify. Third, I implore the administration to remain focused on Afghanistan. It's critically important that the world bear witness and take action when possible in response to Taliban abuses. Your visit, Mr. Secretary, to Qatar and Germany sent the right message, and I strongly urge sustained attention to Afghanistan in the months and years to come. I also urge the administration to strengthen its resolve in efforts to secure the relocation of our civil society partners now at grave risk, who were left behind in Afghanistan. They include heroic individuals working for organizations on the front lines of U.S. efforts to strengthen democracy and human rights, including the rights of Afghan women and girls. Finally, I know that Senator Young is not with us today. He is home in Indiana, attending the funeral of Marine Corporal Humberto Sanchez. Corporal Sanchez was among those killed in the horrendous terror attack on August 26th at the Kabul airport. I'd like to suggest that we have a moment of silence and pay our respects to all those brave American service members who were killed or injured on that day, and that we also honor the thousands of American service members, Afghan soldiers, and civilians who were casualties of this 20-year war. Please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. With that, let me turn to the distinguished ranking member, Senator Risch, for his opening comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Blinken, good morning and welcome back to our committee. You're doing the right thing testifying here today, and I thank you. However, like the chairman, I am disappointed that some of your colleagues have declined to testify, particularly Secretary Austin. There's questions that we really need to have answered, and it's disheartening that they declined to testify. The debacle in Afghanistan is an interagency failure, and the fact that you're the only one stepping up is disheartening. I agree with the chairman that the withdrawal was a dismal failure. One of the things we need to get to the bottom to is who's responsible for this, who made the decisions. There's real questions right now as to who's making the decisions. We know for a fact that the President of the United States is somewhat disadvantaged here in that someone's calling the shots. He can't even speak without someone in the White House censoring it or signing off on it. Is recently as yesterday, in mid-sentence, he was cut off by someone in the White House who makes the decision that the President of the United States is not speaking correctly. So I'd like to know who this person is. This is a puppeteer act, if you would, and we need to know who's in charge and who's making these decisions. And the only way we're going to get that is when we have people like you come in and answer questions. And when we get to question, I'm going to have more questions for you in that regard. Well, I supported a responsible end to the war in Afghanistan. No American thinks we should have left this way. America cannot end war simply by walking away. It is naive to assume our enemies will lay down their arms, leave us alone, and suddenly enshrine human rights if we go home. Indeed, there is a fierce battle of ideas and ambitions on the world stage, and the U.S. cannot remain neutral. However, President Biden presented the American people with a false choice in Afghanistan, and the rushed and embarrassing retreat is a stain on America's credibility that will have implications for years to come. There were other options that could have protected our national security interest, allowed for a more measured reduction in force, and preserved American credibility. I feel this administration is trying to blame the prior administration, and contrary to some that have said that the prior administration started this and is responsible, that's simply not true. The prior administration, when they took steps towards withdrawing from Afghanistan, entered into an agreement that had very, very specific conditions. I was privy to those, so I have personal knowledge of this. In February 2020, agreement was contingent upon the Taliban reducing violence, meeting counterterrorism commitments, and engaging in substantive talks with the Afghan government. These were all very important, and most importantly, it was telegraphed to the Taliban that failure to meet their commitments would be met with grave circumstances for them. The Taliban failed to meet any of these commitments, and yet this administration turned the country over to them. President Biden chose to withdraw from Afghanistan without conditions and without prudent planning and obviously without, most important, telegraphing to the Taliban that they would enforce the conditions that the Taliban had agreed to. It didn't happen. It was a strategic, unforced error, and he did this against the advice of the commanders on the ground. One of the most embarrassing things I thought was the strike that was made, and obviously we can't talk about what we know from an intelligence standpoint, but the kinetic strike that was made after the Taliban entered the country, this de minimis strike, had dire consequences for civilians, but not for the Taliban. These are facts, and the president's withdrawal led to a Taliban offensive that toppled a democratically elected government, slammed the door on any chance for a final peace agreement, reversed the hard-earned rights of Afghan women and minorities, and will result in a safe haven for terrorists, many of whom wish to attack the United States. The Biden administration left Afghanistan in total disarray and single-handedly created a humanitarian crisis with thousands of refugees and internally displaced Afghans in need of immediate emergency assistance. Secretary Blinken, you characterized the evacuation as an extraordinary effort. You've touted over 124,000 evacuees. However, we abandoned the people we prioritized for departure. The department's efforts were plagued by a lack of basic planning, a failure to identify Americans, a failure to energize the SIV process months in advance, ignoring repeated congressional offers to help, and a failure to recognize the Taliban for what it is, a terrorist organization. The numbers are telling. You evacuated 6,040 Americans and say only a couple of hundred remain. Your own department told this committee in July that there were 10 to 15,000 Americans in Afghanistan. There's a huge difference between 6,000 and 15,000. What happened to these other Americans? The situation with the special immigrant visa evacuations is even more disturbing. Not counting the SIVs that arrived before Kabul's fall, you evacuated 705 of roughly 20,000 principal SIV applicants. What happened to these people? This committee reached out to the department in April, May, and June to help expedite SIV processing. We asked what additional authorities or resources you needed. For months, we received contradictory responses or no responses at all. I'll take a minute here to defend the State Department. One of the biggest problems to helping process SIVs was the enormous failure of the Department of Defense to provide the records needed to validate the Afghans who bravely helped our forces. The fact that the DoD didn't keep accurate records is irresponsible and a slap in the face to those who fought alongside of us. Obviously, we want to talk to Secretary Austin about this. Despite the enormous efforts of our troops and diplomats on the ground, the preventable tragedy that unfolded at the airport in Kabul was a disaster of leadership and of the administration's own making. Not only were you unable to ensure that Americans had access to the airport, many were turned away repeatedly after braving Taliban checkpoints, but Americans outside of Kabul had absolutely no chance of evacuation. Green card holders and SIVs should have been prioritized for access to the airport as well, but there was no mechanism to get inside. It was an informal network of Americans that helped get Americans and Afghans around the bureaucratic wall the administration set up at the airport. It should not have come to that. The administration is paying itself in the back for this evacuation is like an arsonist taking credit for saving people from the burning building he just set on fire. We know the U.S. military and our diplomats can do so much more than they did, if only their political bosses had gotten out of the way. Now we have an untold number of Americans, U.S. contractors, and SIVs still in Afghanistan. Despite repeated assurances, you will get them out. You've been unable to do so. Planes are stranded in northern Afghanistan. Our Voice of America employees and female Afghan students on scholarships have been abandoned, and our SIV applicants are in hiding as Taliban death squads hunt them down. You said you would have mechanisms for continued evacuations after 31 August. Where's your plan? I have not seen it. I don't know that I haven't talked to anyone who has seen it. What I have seen is a rebuke from our European allies. They begged us for help. But where we were not helping our own citizens, how could we help them? Instead, we had to rely on the generosity of partners like Qatar. What we have all heard and read is that the United States is no longer a reliable ally. And frankly, the way this evacuation was conducted, I cannot blame them. For years, despite strains in our relations with Europe and other allies, everyone knew the United States was the competent and capable partner. They trusted us to be the steady hand at the wheel that could navigate out of any difficult situation. That confidence has been shattered. Now across the globe, allies doubt our resolve, and our competitors like China and Russia see weakness and think they can exploit this situation. The Biden administration alone is responsible for this debacle and its consequences. Going forward, the challenges become even harder to resolve. U.S. actions must rebuild our credibility and reestablish deterrence. The U.S. will need more proactive policies on counterterrorism and security around the globe to discourage our competitors. Over the weekend, we marked the 20th anniversary of September the 11th, but we have yet to receive details about how the administration's so-called over-the-horizon counterterrorism plan will succeed. The Taliban's takeover destroyed the basis of that strategy, and despite repeated requests from the Hill, we have yet to receive a single piece of information about the administration's revised counterterrorism plan. Meanwhile, the Taliban continues its relationship with al-Qaeda, and the new interior minister has a $10 million U.S. bounty on his head for killing Americans. Any hope that the Taliban will protect American security is a fatally flawed assumption. You must redouble efforts with Afghanistan's neighbors to reach CT agreements and preserve disappearing intelligence networks. Additionally, any country that offered support to the Taliban in their recent offensive should risk a strategic downgrade in their relationship with the United States. We also must understand Pakistan's role in this entire matter, as the chairman has alluded to. This is a difficult but important situation. I also remain concerned that the administration is rushing to normalize ties with the Taliban government. This must not occur without extensive congressional consultations. Your notification that you intended to restart foreign assistance is deeply, deeply concerning. I suspect there's other members of this committee that are going to speak to that. That's going to be a heavy lift for you. On the security front, the United States spent over $80 billion on Afghan security forces. Many of these funds bypassed the oversight of the State Department and this committee. We now see the consequences of a Department of Defense that operates security cooperation on its own. The Taliban is now one of the best armed terrorist organizations on the planet. We have sent repeated requests for the administration's plan to address the captured equipment. We have yet to receive any response. As Secretary, I would hope you would demand that all DoD assistance programs once again require State Department concurrence. In closing, I'd like to speak directly to our diplomats, our men and women in uniform, our Gold Star families, our humanitarian workers, and our veterans. On behalf of the American people, I'd like to say thank you. The ineptitude of this administration does not tarnish your service. What you did mattered. You served nobly. You stood on the wall and prevented a terrorist attack against the United States for over 20 years at enormous cost to you and your families. America will always be indebted to you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rich. Mr. Secretary, the Secretary has agreed to stay with us till each member has an opportunity to answer their questions. As such, and because of the nature of the subject matter, I've agreed that the Secretary has an extended opening statement. With that, Mr. Secretary, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Ranking Member Rich, thank you very much. And to all members, I appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you today to discuss our policy on Afghanistan, including where we are, how we got here, and where we're going in the weeks and months ahead. For 20 years, Congress has conducted oversight and provided funding for the mission in Afghanistan. And I know from my own time as a staff member here in this room for then Senator Biden just how invaluable a partner Congress is. As I said when I was nominated, I believe strongly in Congress's traditional role as a partner in foreign policy making. I'm committed to working with you on the path forward in Afghanistan and to advance the interests of the American people. On this 20th anniversary of 9/11, as we honor nearly 3,000 men, women, and children who lost their lives, we are reminded of why we went to Afghanistan in the first place, to bring justice to those who attacked us and to ensure it would never happen again. We achieved those objectives a long time ago. Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011. Al-Qaeda's capabilities were degraded significantly, including its ability to plan and conduct external operations. After 20 years, 2,461 American lives lost, 20,000 injuries, $2 trillion spent. It was time to end America's longest war. When President Biden took office in January, he inherited an agreement that his predecessor had reached with the Taliban to remove all remaining U.S. forces from Afghanistan by May 1st of this year. As part of that agreement, the previous administration pressed the Afghan government to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners, including some top war commanders. Meanwhile, it reduced our own force presence to 2,500 troops. In return, the Taliban agreed to stop attacking U.S. and partner forces and to refrain from threatening Afghanistan's major cities. But the Taliban continued its relentless march on remote outposts, checkpoints, villages, and districts, as well as some of the major roads connecting the cities. By January of 2021, the Taliban was in its strongest military position since 9/11, and we had the smallest number of U.S. forces in Afghanistan since 2001. As a result, upon taking office, President Biden immediately faced the choice between ending the war or escalating it. Had he not followed through on his predecessor's commitment, attacks on our forces and those of our allies would have resumed, and the Taliban's nationwide assault on Afghanistan's major cities would have commenced. That would have required sending substantially more U.S. forces into Afghanistan to defend ourselves and to prevent a Taliban takeover, taking casualties, and with at best the prospect of restoring a stalemate and remaining stuck in Afghanistan under fire indefinitely. There's no evidence that staying longer would have made the Afghan security forces or the Afghan government any more resilient or self-sustaining. If 20 years, hundreds of billions of dollars in support, equipment, training did not suffice, why would another year, another 5, another 10? Conversely, there is nothing that strategic competitors like China and Russia, or adversaries like Iran and North Korea, would have liked more than for the United States to re-up a 20-year war and remain bogged down in Afghanistan for another decade. In advance of the President's decision, I was in constant contact with our allies and partners to hear their views and factor them into our thinking. When the President announced the withdrawal, NATO immediately and unanimously embraced it. We all set to work, together, on the drawdown. Similarly, we were intensely focused on the safety of Americans in Afghanistan. In March, we began urging them to leave the country. In total, between March and August, we sent 19 specific messages without warning, as well as offers of help, including financial assistance to pay for plane tickets. Despite this effort, at the time the evacuation began, there were still thousands of Americans in Afghanistan, almost all of whom were evacuated by August 31st. Many were dual citizens living in Afghanistan for years, decades, generations. Deciding whether or not to leave the place that they know as home is a wrenching decision. In April, we began drawing down our embassy, ordering non-essential personnel to depart. We also used this time to significantly speed up the processing of special immigrant visas for Afghans who worked for us. When we took office, we inherited a program with a 14-step process based on a statutory framework enacted by Congress involving multiple agencies and a backlog of more than 17,000 SIV applicants. There had not been a single SIV applicant interview in Kabul in 9 months, going back to March of 2020. The program was basically in a stall. Within 2 weeks of taking office, we restarted the SIV interview process in Kabul. On February 4th, one of the first executive orders issued by President Biden directed us to immediately review the SIV program, to identify causes of undue delay, and find ways to process SIV applications more quickly. This spring, I directed significant additional resources to the program, expanding the team of people in Washington processing applications from 10 to 50, doubling the number of SIV adjudicators in Kabul in our embassy there. Even as many embassy personnel began to return under ordered departure, we sent more consular officers to Kabul to process SIV applications. As a result of these and other steps, including working with Congress, especially this committee, Senator Shaheen and others, by May, we had reduced the average processing time for special immigrant visas by more than 1 year. Even amid a COVID surge in Kabul, we continued to issue visas. And we went from issuing about 100 special immigrant visas per week in March to more than 1,000 per week in August, when our evacuation and relocation effort began. That emergency evacuation was sparked by the collapse of the Afghan security forces and government. Throughout the year, we were constantly assessing their staying power and considering multiple scenarios. Even the most pessimistic assessments did not predict that the government forces in Kabul would collapse while U.S. forces remained. They were focused on what would happen after the United States withdrew, from September onward. As General Milley, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said, nothing I or anyone else saw indicated a collapse of this Army and this government in 11 days. Nonetheless, we planned and exercised a wide range of contingencies. Because of that planning, we were able to draw down our embassy and move our remaining personnel to the airport within 48 hours. And the military, placed on standby by President Biden, was able to secure the airport and start the evacuation within 72 hours. And yes, that evacuation was an extraordinary effort under the most difficult conditions imaginable, by our diplomats, by our military, by our intelligence professionals. They worked around the clock to get American citizens, Afghans who helped us, citizens of our allies and partners, and at-risk Afghans on planes out of the country, off to the United States or to transit locations that our diplomats had arranged or negotiated in multiple countries. Our consular team worked 24/7 to reach out to Americans who could still be in country, making 55,000 phone calls, sending 33,000 emails by August 31st. And they're still at it. In the midst of this heroic effort, an ISIS-K attack killed 13 service members working the gates at H-Kaya, wounded 20 others, killed and wounded scores of Afghans. Our service members gave their lives so that others can continue to live theirs. In the end, we completed one of the biggest airlifts in history, with 124,000 people evacuated to safety. And on August 31st, in Kabul, the military mission in Afghanistan officially ended, and a new diplomatic mission began. I want to acknowledge the more than 24 countries that have helped with the relocation effort, some serving as transit hubs, some welcoming Afghan evacuees for longer periods of time. And as the 9/11 report suggested, it is essential that we accelerate the appointment process for national security officials, since a catastrophic attack could occur with little or no notice. Today, there are nearly 80 State Department nominees pending before the Senate. Nearly 24 have already been voted out of this committee on a strong bipartisan basis and simply await a vote in the Senate. For our national security, I respectfully urge the Senate and this committee to move as swiftly as possible to consider and confirm all pending nominees and to address what is a significant disruption in our national security policymaking. Now, let me briefly outline what the State Department has done in the last couple of weeks and where we're going in the weeks ahead. First, as you know, we moved our diplomatic operations from Kabul to Doha, where our new Afghan affairs team is hard at work. Many of our key partners have done the same thing. They've joined us there in Doha. Second, we've continued our relentless efforts to help any remaining Americans, as well as Afghans and citizens of allied and partner nations, leave Afghanistan if they choose. Last week, on Thursday, a Qatar Airways charter flight with U.S. citizens and others on board departed Kabul and landed in Doha. On Friday, a second flight carrying U.S. citizens and others departed Afghanistan. These flights were the result of coordinated efforts by the United States, Qatar, and Turkey to reopen the airport and intense diplomacy to start the flights. In addition to those flights, half a dozen American citizens, a dozen permanent residents of the United States have also left Afghanistan via overland routes with our assistance. We're in constant contact with American citizens still in Afghanistan who've told us they wish to leave. Each has been assigned a case management team to offer specific guidance and instructions. Some declined to be on the first flights on Thursday and Friday for reasons including needing more time to make arrangements, wanting to remain with extended family for now, or medical issues that precluded traveling last week. We will continue to help Americans and Afghans to whom we have a special commitment depart Afghanistan if they choose, just as we've done in other countries where we've evacuated our embassy and hundreds or even thousands of Americans remain behind. For example, in Libya, Syria, Venezuela, Yemen, Somalia. There's no deadline to this effort. Third, we're focused on counterterrorism. Taliban's committed to prevent terrorist groups from using Afghanistan as a base for external operations that could threaten the United States or our allies, including al-Qaeda and ISIS-K. We'll hold them accountable for that. That does not mean that we will rely on them. We will maintain a vigilant effort to monitor threats, robust counterterrorism capabilities in the region, to neutralize those threats if necessary, and as we do in places around the world where we do not have military forces on the ground. Fourth, we continue our intensive diplomacy with allies and partners. We initiated a statement joined by more than 100 countries and a United Nations Security Council resolution setting out the international community's expectations of a Taliban-led government. We expect the Taliban to ensure freedom of travel, to make good on its counterterrorism commitments, to uphold the basic rights of the Afghan people, including women, girls, minorities, to name a broadly representative permanent government, to forswear reprisals. The legitimacy and support that it seeks from the international community will depend entirely on its conduct. We've organized contact groups of key countries to ensure that the international community continues to speak and act together on Afghanistan and to leverage our combined influence. Last week, I led a ministerial meeting of 22 countries, plus NATO, the EU, the United Nations, to align our efforts. And fifth, we'll continue to support humanitarian aid to the Afghan people, consistent with sanctions. This aid will not flow through the government, but rather through independent organizations like NGOs and UN agencies. Yesterday, we announced that the United States has provided nearly $64 million in new humanitarian assistance to the people of Afghanistan to meet critical health and nutrition needs, to address the protection concerns of women, children, and minorities, to help more children, including girls, go back to school. This additional funding means the United States has provided nearly $330 million in assistance to the Afghan people this fiscal year. In Doha and Ramstein, I toured the facilities where Afghans that we evacuated are being processed before moving on to their next destinations. Here at home, I spent time at the Dulles Expo Center, where more than 45,000 Afghans have been processed after arriving in the United States. It's remarkable to see what our diplomats, our military, employees from many civilian agencies across the U.S. government have been able to achieve in a very short time. They've met an enormous human need. They've coordinated food, water, sanitation for thousands of people. They're arranging medical care, including the delivery of babies. They're reuniting families that were separated, caring for unaccompanied minors. It's an extraordinary interagency effort, a powerful testament to the skill, the dedication, the humanity of our people. And I think we can all be deeply proud of what they're doing, and as we've done throughout our history, Americans are now welcoming families from Afghanistan into our communities, helping them resettle as they start new lives. And that's something to be proud of as well. With that, I thank the members of this committee and look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Let me first begin by asking unanimous consent to enter to the hearing record a letter by the U.S. Afghan Women's Council calling on the Biden administration to take immediate action at the United Nations to protect Afghan civilians, particularly women and girls. Without objection, it's so ordered. All right, let's start a series of 7-minute rounds. I'm going to hold the time tight so that every member can get their opportunity, and I'll start off by making sure that I don't exceed my 7 minutes. So, prior to the final flight out, we heard from both American citizens and Afghan partners seeking to access the airport, but they were either not being allowed to the gates, being sent back home, or simply abandoned. While we understand and appreciate the security issues that were at play, it's confounding that such a chaotic process arose to begin with. So, when did the administration begin to plan for a worst-case scenario contingency?
In the spring and summer.
in the spring and summer of this year.
Yes, multiple interagency meetings, exercises, looking at the different contingencies.
And so what was the specific planning put into the likely scenario that American citizens were going to have to evacuate under hostile conditions?
Well, planning went to a number of things, including the ability to move our embassy quickly, as we did in 48 hours, including the effort to make sure that we could control the airport, bring flights in, and evacuate people out. One of the things that happened, as you know, Mr. Chairman, is that the situation outside the airport became incredibly chaotic, with thousands of people massing at the airport, massing at the gates of the airport, and that created, among other things, a very, very challenging situation.
Should we not have started earlier? Should not have been a bigger surge on the SIV issue? I recognize, I think it's only fair to put in context that your own testimony suggested that there was a 17,000 SIV backlog. There hadn't 9 months had passed by without a single interview. So obviously you inherited a significant backlog. But and how many SIVs were awarded during the Trump administration?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think over the course of the administration, there must have been several thousand.
Okay.
Issued.
So the question is then, should we not have surged more significantly? I know you said you put up to 50 individuals, but knowing that you were preparing for a contingency of the worst-case scenario, should not back in March there have been a more significant surge to process SIVs and determine the entire universe and who needed to be taken out? Well,
I believe we did surge those resources. As I said, we quadrupled the number of people in Washington doing processing of SIVs, and this is at a critical stage in the processing. As I think many members know, the most important stage in many ways is the so-called chief of mission approval. That's the stage at which SIV applicants are actually deemed eligible under the criteria established by Congress for the program. And by the way, those who apply, those who actually get chief of mission approval, the washout rate is about 40% historically. That's because it turns out that many people who apply don't qualify under the criteria set by Congress, or they're unable to get the documentation, I think this was alluded to prove that they had worked faithfully and loyally for the United States. There's some situations where people are committing fraud in order to get into the program, maybe for understandable reasons. But the point is, we have a very lengthy process, 14 steps, multiple agencies involved. We work to try to streamline that. I think there's more work that we would like to do going forward to do that. But the bottom line is, we did significantly surge our resources to that, particularly to the chief of mission approval process, quadrupling them, and ultimately we went from 10 to 50 to now, I believe, 61 or 62, working on that stage of things. We doubled the resources we had in Kabul, all in an effort to expedite. And we did. We went from 100 visas a week to 1,000 visas a week. But what was not anticipated was the collapse in 11 days of the Afghan government and the Afghan military.
Let me ask you this. There have been numerous press reports over the past week about a new or refined process for the State Department to lead efforts in coordination with the Department of Defense to work with outside groups to evacuate American citizens and Afghan allies left behind in Afghanistan. Can you tell us exactly what these new U.S. government-led efforts are, how coordination with outside groups and individuals is being handled, by who, what is the nature of the state DoD cooperation? Give us a sense of that.
Sure. We have, within the department, led by our former ambassador to Afghanistan, John Bass, who went back to Kabul to the airport to help lead the evacuation efforts. He is leading an effort to manage, coordinate all of the ongoing efforts to bring people who wish to leave Afghanistan out. And that includes, among other things, a coordination with the many outside groups, as well as members of Congress, who are working themselves heroically to help in this effort. I met myself with about 75 veterans organizations a couple of weeks ago, given the extraordinary efforts that veterans, either individually or as groups, are doing to help. And we want to make sure that we are as coordinated as we possibly can be on these efforts to make sure that we know who is doing what assistance we can provide, and to make sure that we're working together going forward. We have many other people working on this task force, some dedicated to American citizens, others focused on SIVs and other Afghans at risk, others focused on coordinating with different groups, including members of Congress.
Let me give you my final minute. I'd like to give you an opportunity to set the record straight on one point. Several commentators have suggested that had the department moved forward with a Crisis Contingency and Response Bureau proposed by the Trump administration as it was walking out the door, it would have been able to respond better to the Afghan situation. But it's my understanding that that bureau had not been stood up yet when you decided to curtail the proposal, nor as proposed did it actually add any additional resources or capabilities to those that state already had. It was a bureaucratic movement, not creating or getting rid of actual capabilities, just a new organizational chart. And in that bureaucratic reshuffling, potentially creating damage to the department's operations, not solving them. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. If it's not the CCR, then what is the answer?
Well, here again, to your point, with regard to the CCR, whether it became a bureau or not, there was no change in the assets that we already had at hand to work on these efforts. And the focus of this group, either in its existing organizational structure or had it become a bureau, which, among other things, it didn't because there were congressional holds across the aisle on this effort. The previous administration, nonetheless, went through and tried to move it forward. We decided that we needed to review it. We did the review, and as you described very accurately, we found that this would add no assets to what we already had at hand. It would simply create a different bureaucratic structure. But having said that, again, this is something designed primarily for individual extractions, medical emergencies. These men and women who are part of our operational medical unit are remarkable and do incredible work, but not the kind of work that would have been applicable to the large evacuation that we had to conduct in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I can tell you, I've listened to you and a handful of other people try to put the best face on this possible, and I can tell you that the temperature of the American people is not there with you. And that, I'm not talking from a partisan basis, this goes both ways. You know, there is not enough lipstick in the world to put on this pig to make it look any different than what it actually is. So the American people want to know who's responsible for this. So let's start with this. Who is responsible? Who made the decisions on this? Was it the President of the United States?
Ultimately, the President makes the decisions. That's correct.
Did he in this case?
As in every case, ultimately decisions that can only be decided by the President are decided by the President.
Well,
now, of course, to be specific, Senator,